Good morning and welcome to the Essential Service Commission's annual Victorian Energy Upgrades Forum. I'm Dan Keeley. I'm the Exec Director of the VEU program here at the Commission. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on Aboriginal land and acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands on which we're joining the meeting from. For me, that's the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past and present, elders of other communities who may be joining us today, and welcome all First Peoples that might be attending the meeting. We'll get on to some housekeeping. It's great to see such a strong turnout from industry. You all play such a vital role in the VEU program, and I hope that you enjoy the forum. A couple of things to note. The session today is being recorded, and we'll publish the video and slides on our website after the forum. Your microphones are muted so we can hear the presentations, but please feel free to keep your cameras on. We'll jump on to the agenda for today now, and you'll hear a range of speakers from the Commission and from Solar Victoria today. Topics that we'll cover include an update on how the program is tracking, including some key data, some information about our compliance and enforcement priorities, a policy update from Solar Victoria, some information about the new VEU registry system, and then some new developments, including the energy upgrades from the future bill and the quality assurance expectations that flow from those updates to the legislation. Towards the end of the session, we'll have time for questions and answers, and so we'll now go to how to post a question, and feel free to post questions throughout the presentations and we will get to them at the end during the Q&A session. So as shown on screen, you can submit a question by selecting the Q&A button in the menu and submitting a question in the window. If you're on a mobile device, you'll need to click on the three dots in the menu to find that Q&A button. So that we can get through as many questions as possible, please upvote questions, give them a thumbs up, give them a heart that others have posted in the Q&A window if you'd like them answered, rather than posting the same question again. If you've got questions that are really specific to your business or very technical questions, please contact us by email, phone, or via the registry, and we'll get back to you separately. We may, if they're relatively straightforward, respond to questions in the Q&A window, so look out for that, and similar questions we'll attempt to tackle in one go, so we may not read out your exact question. And with that, we'll get into the content, and I'll hand over to our first presenter, Kate Phillips.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, all. Lovely to see you here today. I'm Kate Phillips, and I job share the role of Director of Development alongside Maxi Porter-Hoibeck, who you'll hear from a little bit later on this morning. And this morning, I'm going to provide a bit of a snapshot of what's been happening over the past year. So if we turn to the next slide, you can see that we've had substantial increases in the number of VEECs created and registered, with 7.2 million VEECs created over the last year. And so that's from this time last year until now. So not quite aligning with a calendar year or a financial year, but we thought we'd keep it consistent. This is showing the growth in several activities, with increased registrations also reflecting the Commission's work to improve the registration process. And if you look at this slide, you can also see that the number of premises upgraded and upgrades delivered has fallen substantially, which reflects the program's shift toward more complex electrification activities that have greater impact on energy efficiency, reflected in the higher number of VEECs for these activities. On the project-based activities side of the house, the number of activities approved has also increased by over a third. We've also hit a major milestone over the past year of 1 million VEECs created through project-based activities, another significant achievement for the program. If we turn to the next slide, you can see the composition of the types of upgrades that are being done in Victoria. And you can see that space heating and cooling continues to dominate upgrades, increasing by over 200% over the last year and continuing to trend up. Commercial and industrial water heating also increased substantially from the same period in the previous year. And building-based lighting, residential water heating and project-based activities round out our top 5 VEEC creating activities for the past year. On the next slide, we can see that consumers do continue to access a range of other activities under the program, as well as these top 5 from the previous slide, with refrigerated cabinets contributing over 122,000 weeks over the past year, which is a slight drop from the year prior. And while the number of installations for weather sealing and shower roses are falling, we still do see Victorians undertaking thousands of these installations every year, reflecting their important contribution to improving energy efficiency. The last one I'll point out on this slide as one to watch is the Home Energy Rating Assessment. And while it's coming off a low base, this activity increased over 300% over the last year, potentially indicating more Victorians becoming interested in what they can do to optimise energy in their home or business. On the next slide, you'll see that we've experienced growth across many dimensions of the program. We've had 80 new APs approved over the past year, up 85% from the previous period, and bringing us to 170 active APs overall. We've also seen an additional 1,354 products approved, giving Victorians access to improved products as they come onto the market. Inquiries have also increased since the same period last year, likely partially driven by the launch of the Salesforce registry, which Maxi will speak to shortly. Importantly, response times have remained stable over this period, exceeding KPIs, including during the peak of the VU registry launch. Commission has also been focused on improving the quality and compliance of APs in the market, and we've applied 88 conditions as a result of the accreditation renewal process, as well as refusing 18 accreditations. This reflects our continued commitment to improving the quality of the VU program and the compliance of those who participate. Commissioner Patera will speak more about related compliance and enforcement actions shortly. If we turn to the next slide, you can see that we've also been undertaking more engagement to support compliance with the VU program. We've increased the frequency of webinars to support stakeholders, for example, the information sessions held during the registry transition, and we're also adding a new industry reference group. We're currently finalising this, and we'd like to thank all who expressed their interest in being part of this group. We'll provide more information to those who expressed interest very shortly. We continue to release detailed program updates, which include new and updated guidance materials, changes to record-keeping requirements, activity eligibility, and compliance advice. We've also been working to streamline our communications to you. Our monthly VU bulletin has been running for a year now, bringing all of our updates together in one place to make it easier for you to find, track, and refer to program information and compliance advice. Regular compliance alerts have been issued to highlight emerging risks and to publish information about enforcement outcomes. We're also providing more advice on requirements when closing out compliance matters to help APs and SPs learn from issues as they arise, strengthen understanding of program rules and regulations, and reduce the likelihood of future non-compliance. Finally, we really value your feedback. Thank you for participating in the AP annual survey we ran earlier this year. The information provided will help us to improve our education and engagement work, including the implementation of the new industry reference group and other initiatives such as webinars to support industry engagement. That's all for the overview of the last year. I'm pleased to now hand over to our VU Sponsoring Commissioner, Ellie Patera.
Thanks so much, Kate, and good morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. This is actually my first VEU forum. As Kate mentioned, my name is Ellie Patera. I'm one of the commissioners here at the Essential Services Commission, and I'm the sponsoring commissioner for the VEU program. The Commission introduced this sponsoring commissioner model at the start of this year, and it was really to ensure that we do have a dedicated focus at the commissioner level on strategic issues across all of the sectors we regulate, and that includes the VEU program. And I really appreciate the opportunities I've had so far to engage with scheme participants and accredited persons to really understand some of the key program issues from your perspective. Today, I'll be talking broadly about our evolving approach and priorities as a regulator of the VEU program, and with a particular focus on compliance and enforcement priorities. And it's fair to say there's a real evolving strategic focus and risk settings for the VEU program. the last 18 months has seen a huge amount of change at the Commission. That includes the appointment of a new chair, the appointment of 2 new commissioners, including myself, the development of a new strategic plan, which does have a particular focus on elements of the VEU program, and that was launched in June of this year. And we also have a new risk appetite statement. And I touch on that because one of the 7 strategic risks that's been identified Commission-wide is integrity risks in the VEU program. We, as a Commission, have articulated a really low appetite for fraud and other events that materially undermine program integrity, and we're really focusing resources to address these risks. And to complement this work, we also issued Commission-wide compliance and enforcement priorities in July, and that includes, again, a specific focus on areas within the VEU program. In coming up with those areas of focus for our compliance and enforcement efforts, we've really focused on areas where we see greatest risk and risk of consumer harm or impacts to market. And we obviously focus on these, but we continue to pursue any area where we see significant risks in program integrity that we identify through other means, including surveillance and data and analytics. It's fair to say that at the same time that we've had these changes at a commissioner level, there's also a changing regulatory role for the Commission and the way that it's administering and regulating the VEU program. So you would be aware that our role in administering the VEU program has really broadened and is really focusing now on better protecting consumers and program integrity. And this has really been made possible through legislative change that has seen a real expansion of the Commission's functions and powers, as well as a broadening of industry obligations. And I might just touch on some of the key areas where you might notice that shift and that evolution of our functions and powers. So the first is that we have expanded compliance and enforcement tools, and that means we really can take appropriate and proportionate action based on risk and harm. And that includes where risk is contained to a specific activity. We will look at restricting accredited persons from that activity of concern rather than a full suspension. Now, for more serious breaches, we will immediately suspend accredited persons while we further investigate. And we also have powers to issue penalties, including penalties directly to scheme participants as well as accredited persons. We've also increased our surveillance of the program to identify non-compliance, and we're doing that through more site inspections, deeper monitoring and analysis of program data that we have to hand, really mobilising resources to tackle emerging risks, and that's probably best demonstrated through our fraud task force, as well as information sharing and collaboration with our other regulators and agencies where issues arise. And that's true in our relationships with Solar Victoria, Energy Safe Victoria, and the Building and Plumbing Commission. A third area where you might see some of our key changes is the growing number of refusals of accreditations for new applicants and for renewals as well. This work around accreditations and refusals really complements our existing monitoring of what's going on in the program, including assessment of certificates, audits, consumer surveys, and investigating tip-offs. Overall, I think the picture you should be getting is that we are really focused on lifting the standards across the program. I will focus, though, today on compliance and enforcement and where we're focusing our resources in the VEU program, and give you a bit of an overview, I guess, of the progress that's been made in these areas to date. So I'll talk through some of our key priorities, and the first of those priorities is addressing conduct that compromises market integrity. Really addressing market integrity risk remains a top priority for the Commission. And it really means that we are focused on both APs and SPs that engage in fraudulent conduct, including creating certificates based on falsified activities or where the pre-existing environment has been falsified or in some way altered. And we are equally looking at upgrades that are being performed without consumer consent. Now, we've made some real progress in this area. You'll be aware that the Fraud Task Force was set up this year, together with a real increase in compliance monitoring and other investigations, and that has identified fraudulent and what we consider concerning conduct that harms program integrity. We've seen cases where certificates were claimed for upgrades that never occurred, where the same equipment or manipulated photos were submitted to inflate certificate claims, and where consumer consent was not obtained for the upgrade. So far this year, we've taken quite a bit of enforcement action against 12 accredited persons for providing false information to the Commission, and 3 of these were related to work done through the Fraud Task Force, and more investigation is underway. We really want to make clear that we won't hesitate to take swift action where we identify systemic issues that threaten the integrity of the program. And it's really important that accredited persons ensure that they have adequate controls, including their own internal audits and quality assurance, to be able to identify matters before certificates are created. There are significant penalties that may apply for submitting false or misleading information. And I think equally important, and something we really want to highlight, is the relevance and importance of self-reporting. The Code of Conduct does require high levels of professional and ethical conduct from all program participants. And if you do become aware of non-compliance in your operations, then we do expect that you self-report. And I think relevantly for you, it's important to know that we do take this into consideration when we're making enforcement decisions and when we're determining what an appropriate response is from the Commission. On to the next slide and the next priority. We're really focused on taking action to address practices that exacerbate cost of living pressures across the Commission, and relevantly for the VEU program, we're prioritising acting where we see any conduct that contributes to or exploits those cost of living pressures. So what does this look like for the VEU program? Well, it's really about failures to comply with the Code of Conduct provisions that undermine a consumer's ability to make informed choices about VEU incentives and energy efficiency benefits, as well as complying with installation standards so that consumers actually receive expected energy efficiency benefits. In terms of the progress that we've made in this particular priority area, we've so far taken enforcement action against 3 accredited persons and a scheme participant this year for not providing required information to consumers so that they can make those informed choices. And we are also increasingly providing risk-based oversight of the program. So an example is our recent response to industrial heat pump water compliance. So we undertook a compliance blitz to make sure that the right products are installed compliantly, that they're in the consumer's best interests, and that they actually realise the expected energy efficiency benefits. The blitz was a response to potential problems that we identified through our surveillance and involved the rapid mobilisation of resources to manage that risk through site inspections, investigations, and other compliance activities. Finally, we have a priority which is around holding businesses accountable when they fail to provide consumers experiencing vulnerability with fair and equitable access to essential services. So that's a Commission-wide priority that we have. In terms of this priority and how it's relevant to the VEU program, I suppose, have always had a focus at the Commission on vulnerability and on consumers who are experiencing vulnerability. But for the VEU program, it's about addressing conduct that targets or exploits consumer vulnerability, particularly in marketing and lead generation, and practices, again, that undermine consumer protections, like telemarketing and door knocking, as well as failures to rectify faulty, unsuitable or unsafe installations. The progress we've made in this area, again, thanks to our enhanced program surveillance, we've taken enforcement action against 7 accredited persons this year for breaches in these areas, and this includes cases where door knocking and telemarketing were used to in breach of the bans, consumer consent was not provided for upgrades, and high pressure sales tactics were used. I might just give a bit of a summary snapshot of enforcement action taken this year, because I think it's a really important part of our understanding our changing regulatory posture. But in 2025 alone, we've taken enforcement action that includes 6 accreditation restrictions, 3 suspensions, 3 immediate suspensions and 2 cancellations, 4 penalties issued to an accredited person and scheme participant, totaling 92,000. We've required 154,000 certificates to be refused or surrendered, valued at around 14 million. We've required 6 accredited persons to complete compliance audits, and we've issued 11 warnings to accredited persons. As you can see, we are closely monitoring what's going on in the program and taking action for breaches, really to manage risk and to make clear that breaking the rules is not okay. And whether you're an accredited person, an energy retailer, or a certificate trader, you must be considered competent, capable, and fit and proper to participate in the program. And this includes looking at compliance history in the VEU program and in other schemes. We've refused accreditation and VEET scheme registry account applications that don't meet these requirements. And accredited persons and scheme participants must also make sure that they have safeguards in place to make sure that upgrades meet the program rules. And this includes making sure that SPs doing work on your behalf, where you're an AP, are doing the right thing. If you don't, there will be hefty financial and other consequences for your business, such as certificate refusals, accreditations, suspensions, mandatory surrenders for certificates as well. We can, again, issue restrictions and penalties. You may also have your VEET scheme registry account or accreditation cancelled or applications refused, so you can't participate in the program. It's an important part, I think, for us of maintaining program integrity. I might finish by just quickly looking ahead and just acknowledging that, the VEU program is ever expanding its scope of activities, and our regulatory role will continue to evolve as the scheme grows. One thing I did really want to point out is administrative efficiency of this scheme is becoming particularly important to us, especially as it grows. And with this in mind, I think perhaps the last thing I'd like to touch on is we are really interested in making sure we maintain that administrative efficiency by making sure that APs provide complete and sufficient documentation through the accreditation, certificate registration, project-based activity and product application processes. At present, the Commission does expend significant time and resources engaging with APs following the submission of documentation where we're looking to address deficiencies, really on a bit of an ad hoc basis. There's a significant amount of time and effort spent going back and forth trying to get documentation up to scratch. And I think we are really focused, as we focus on administrative efficiency, on using our powers of refusal where appropriate. And that'll mean that the onus will be back on APs to ensure that the quality of their documentation is up to scratch. That may require resubmission afresh and attracting new application fees. So we really, really want to push on the quality of your documentation. It's important that industry is aware of these changing expectations and is able to adapt. We'll obviously work with you so that you understand your obligations and are able to comply. And we'll do that through these forums and through continued engagement with other sessions, making sure that we're seeking your feedback and input where appropriate, and making sure that our guidance and our support materials are appropriate to be able to support you to comply. I'll leave it there. We'll talk a bit more this morning. You'll hear from other people around energy upgrades for the future bills. And, I'm really looking forward to working with our new industry reference group to deliver some great consumer and program outcomes. But for now, what I will do is hand over to our next presenter, Stan Kapan, who is CEO of Solar Victoria.
Thanks so much, Commissioner, and good morning, everybody. Solar Victoria sits within DECA, the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, and we're responsible for policy settings and, of course, program design and settings, legislative change, and work very closely. And just to say that we really welcome the partnership that we've had with the Essential Services Commission. Delighted to be invited this morning, but in particular that relationship has strengthened over time, including on operational compliance and enforcement matters and through our regulatory task force. And we're really pleased to see that continue and strengthen, and some of the results of that close collaboration are seen in Commissioner Patira's presentation. What I wanted to do this morning was provide a bit of a backdrop on policy reforms. I won't go through everything that's happening in the Victorian government, but there are some really important positive signals in terms of the future of the VEU. I'll reflect on some of the changes that have occurred this year, and then of course look forward to 2026 and share some insights around that. The Minister, when she handed over responsibility for legislation and policy to Solar Victoria, which up until recently has been only delivering the solar homes program and focusing on the solar sector, made it really clear that she was looking to VEU to be the flagship for emissions reduction, and that the program would continue to evolve over time, that it would continue to grow and strengthen, and particularly the strategic review, which we've been now leading since June of 2024, has been looking to expand the program so that it is fit for purpose for net zero by 2045, which is the government's legislative commitment, but also to be able to electrify homes and businesses rapidly and at scale. And the backdrop for that from a policy setting is really clear. The government published its first gas substitution roadmap in 2022, and that is all about supporting households to transition away from increasingly expensive gas appliances, and to support businesses to make that transition also where that's possible, but recognising that gas, which is becoming more scarce, more expensive, needs to be preserved, particularly for those large businesses that can't get off gas, that can't electrify, or that use gas as a feedstock. The gas substitution roadmap was updated last year. We're expecting in coming weeks that it will be again updated, and that progress report will continue. But importantly, since the last update, the government has introduced new electrification and efficiency standards for Victorian buildings, which will see all new commercial buildings from 2027 and all new residential buildings being all electric and not connected to gas at all. And without going into the details, minimum energy efficiency standards for rental properties will see that some end-of-life appliances will need to be replaced from March 2027 with electric alternatives, and that in the case of owner-occupied properties, that water heating will need to be, there are some exemptions, but where those exemptions don't apply, will need to be replaced with an electric alternative. So in other words, a hot water heat pump. This is all very positive, I think, as for the future outlook for Victorian Energy Upgrades, but also for the APs that participate in that. And you would have seen from Kate's presentation that, in fact, the scheme has really, since 2023, transformed around those key areas of gas usage, and to support households and businesses to electrify. Not exclusively, but they will continue to be important features. I'll just go to some of the statistics around the VEU program as a key contributor to energy transition. And as I've said, emissions reduction, 94 million tonnes of carbon emissions saved to date. That's effectively more than last year's emissions from the whole of the state's economy, which was about 84 million tonnes. The scheme aims to, of course, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to support the gas substitution roadmap for electrification, to support energy efficiency upgrades for Victorian homes and businesses by reducing their costs. And you'll see there $590 million in 24-25 has been invested into the pockets of households and businesses to become more energy efficient, to reduce their energy bills. And of course, at a system-wide level, the contribution of reducing energy usage in just 1 year by 7% allows us to avoid very expensive infrastructure upgrades. And that's been quantified at $3.8 billion. So it makes a big difference to the people that participate, but also to all energy consumers, whether they participate or not. Reflecting on some of what has been achieved over the last year, as you heard from Kate, in terms of certificate generation and creation, 2026 and 2027 targets will be set, but the 2024 target was met. We've been focusing a lot on liquidity of certificates and liquidity in the market through both legislative change, through flexibility, including through administrative decisions made by the ESC to enable more flexible arrangements for the surrender of certificates and a bit more time, particularly last year, but also by focusing on those activities that can create further certificates. Energy upgrades for the future bill was passed by Parliament earlier this year, and I'll touch on that in a moment. We also introduced the commercial and industrial solar activity as a new activity, which is proving to be really popular. Lots of interest there, and we see huge potential around that sector. About 7 gigawatts of potential on rooftops for commercial and industrial solar has been quantified by the University of New South Wales. And we see that as an important enabler that is really removing the upfront cash and capital challenge by providing those discounts upfront, as opposed to the existing project-based assessments, which do that after a period of monitoring and verifications. We've also recognised that the project-based assessment project-based activities needed reform to streamline and simplify that process, including changes to make it more accessible for commercial and industrial businesses, as well as for commercial building upgrades. And we really appreciated the level of business and stakeholder engagement in that process to provide insights in a roundtable in December of last year that would lead to those reforms, and those regulations have now been made. And of course, the Minister also announced the launch of the retrofit installation program, and we now provide free training in that area. And again, I'll touch on that. In terms of next year, I've already talked about the policy outlook, and the government and Minister have been pretty buoyant. The Minister described VEU as one of her proudest achievements at All Energy just a few weeks ago, and sees the program continuing to grow in relevance and accessibility for businesses and households. And that will mean that for 2026, it'll be a big year. They're always big years, I think, for VEU, and with our colleagues at the EEC, we recognise that level of ambition and policy alignment is growing, and that the relevance of the program has never been greater since it was created in 2009. We will continue to review activities, and that includes a targeted review around the heating and cooling activity, which is the largest part of the program now, but making sure that that's relevant, that it continues to keep up with innovation, new products, and also industry and market settings, as well as consumer demand, and also water heating as well. And that activity will continue. There'll be a particular focus also on business activities, recognising the importance of the commercial and industrial sector and the gas substitution roadmap and the Victorian Government's economic growth statement, looking at making sure that businesses continue to see VEU as relevant, and that the program is adapting and continuing to recognise and meet the needs of businesses around electrification, energy efficiency and gas efficiency. And then also continued program reforms as well. I'll just move to the next slide. In terms of the Act amendments that were made through what was called the Energy Upgrades for the Future Act earlier this year, which has passed, importantly, many of the provisions there are either now in force or have created enabling provisions, so heads of power that will require regulations into 2026, which will be made, but it will give you a sense of where the government's policy direction is. The first is that there's been changes to remove the additionality requirement subject to regulations being made, and the Minister has been overt that she will consider making regulations that will allow the additionality requirement to be removed in relation to some of those regulatory obligations for building upgrades and household upgrades and rental upgrades that I alerted to earlier in the presentation. And so those regulations will be consulted upon and then made next year. But that is an indication that the government is looking at more flexible arrangements there and to support that transition to higher regulatory standards. Support for vulnerable and low income consumers, which allows, again, for regulations for activities and certificates and incentives to be targeted and designed particularly for vulnerable and low income consumers or particular cohorts of customers. continuation of the program to align with the government's net zero target of 2045, and that aligns, of course, to the New South Wales scheme now and gives that long-term certainty to participating businesses and to the market that the scheme is expected to continue to grow and be relevant to that to those policy commitments, and more flexibility for retailers to comply, as I've already adverted to. I won't go on in too much detail on commercial and industrial sites because I've already referred to some of the changes that we made there. Project-based activities have continued to grow in importance, but important to know for this, of the 150 of the projects under the PBAs that have been creating certificates, the largest component of those have been in commercial and industrial solar projects. And with the federal government's cheaper home batteries scheme, although it refers to homes, it also applies to businesses up to 70 kilowatt hours, and being able to provide with upfront discounts for batteries, that we see commercial and industrial solar being a market segment that will continue to grow, where there have been some challenges, but the ability to combine upfront discounts for solar with batteries and storage is seen as something that we really wanted to be able to support. In that case, we will be providing upfront discounts for systems between 30 and 200 kilowatts. That can provide an incentive for the larger end of that range of up to $35,000, which is really meaningful because it is able to be stacked with Commonwealth government incentives, which are the small scale certificates, the STCs, and also the large scale certificates, the LGCs, to provide a greater upfront discount in a really streamlined way. And we've been really pleased, again, to work closely with the ESC to expedite the implementation of that that new activity without any disruption to the market. And you would have seen some of the communications from the Commission just recently in relation to that. The frequently asked questions which arose out of our stakeholder consultation and the joint briefings we provided to industry with the ESC recently have now been published. And thank you. I'll move to the next slide, which is about insulation. I've already referred to the government's announcement. The Premier and the Minister announced this earlier in the year, that they would, after 16 years of hiatus for obvious reasons, which have been traversed in many different reviews since, that insulation will be reintroduced into the Victorian Energy Upgrades Program. It is subject to regulations which we're anticipating will be made early next year, and that incentives will be made available for ceiling insulation retrofit upgrades. And that'll be the first time since that that part of the scheme was deactivated in 2010, I think. We've been consulting really heavily. We've been working in close partnership with the Energy Efficiency Council, which has a certification scheme for ensuring that workers are properly trained, that they're certified and suitably qualified for installing insulation. We are committed to working very closely with the ESC and other regulators, WorkSafe in particular, around designing this scheme so that it is robust and that the regulatory compliance and enforcement oversight is strong. The first bit of that is to ensure that workers are properly trained, and we have just recently announced that we will be fully subsidising the training that is required, and there are 3 training providers that have now been appointed to provide that training. We've seen growing interest in the training aspect that will then qualify those workers for the certification. It's up to about, I think, $1,500 in costs. All of that will be paid for by the government to encourage this industry to grow, but also grow in a way that is manageable, that is sustainable, and that is ensuring that safety and quality are really at the heart of this part of the program. We've been working closely not only with APs and with others involved in the existing VEU, but also more broadly with the insulation industry, some of whom don't participate currently in VEU, but will be an important enabler and deliverer of the program. The 3 TAFE providers, the RTOs, are on the next slide: Australian Wall and Ceiling Institute, Holmes Glen TAFE, and Built Training. And of course, participants who have completed that training will then be able to apply for the certification, the training and the certification together cost about $3,500. That will be funded by the Victorian government. We've seen about 35 inquiries in the past 3 months, which is expected to grow the workforce in relation to that program. We're hoping that within coming weeks, hopefully by the end of the calendar year, that we'll be able to make further announcements regarding the program settings that will then follow in regulations. And we've been working closely with the ESC, with the relevant safety regulators, and also with the union and the National Electrical Contractors Association, as well as, of course, the insulation sector, to make sure that the program is designed properly. And as I say, that safety and quality are embedded into the regulations and the specifications. And that will include things like the eligible products, the eligible scheme participants, what contractual arrangements we require between accredited persons and SPs, and the eligibility and qualification criteria for APs to be able to participate in that new part of the program. I've probably gone way over time, but I'll just go to a couple of other matters which I know will be of interest, and then happy to answer some questions in the discussion. Over the last 12 months, as I mentioned, we've been undertaking a broader strategic review of the BEU, and that is very much about fit for purpose for the future, and particularly to enable electrification at scale. Some of the matters that we've been consulting on are quite foundational. The terms of reference were very broad, but they were targeted to looking at the purpose and objectives, looking at whether the current metric for certificates, which is CO2 abated, if you like, tonnes abated, is the right metric, and whether that aligns with program goals, particularly as we move to more electrification and more complex upgrade projects. Looking at how we ensure that targets are set, that they're met, but also that there's a more flexible target making framework is another aspect. We've also been looking at activities and products, and simultaneously with the strategic review and the consultations, as you would have seen with the commercial and industrial solar and into next year, we have been working in the background to develop new activities and look at where the needs are and where the demand is and where the opportunities are for energy efficiency, for electrification and emissions reduction, to make sure that we're continuing to evolve and adapt the program, including making changes where that's necessary, as we did just a few months ago with commercial industrial solar, that will continue in tandem with any changes that come from the strategic review. We're also looking at all scheme participants. As Commissioner Patera mentioned, program integrity is at the core of VU. It's incredibly important to the success of the program, but also to its continuation. And that means looking at all of the people that interact with the program, and not necessarily just the APs or the scheme participants, but those that trade in certificates, those that create certificates and have registry accounts, looking at the whole of that supply chain, if you like, and making sure that there is accountability and responsibility and proper conduct, and that there are provisions that allow for that to be overseen by the Commission, have all been part of the consultations today. Ensuring that the ESC has the powers that it needs, not only for compliance and enforcement activity, and that can evolve over time, but also for things like information sharing and increased collaboration with other regulators, which has also been the subject of consultation, as well as some changes that we've made during the year. And then also continuing to ensure that the program meets not only its objectives, but that the costs and benefits are also properly quantified, and that it continues to be justified for further investment, bearing in mind that all energy consumers contribute to the cost of the scheme. And of course, that includes a particular focus on equity and the ability for people to participate. So accessibility, particularly for vulnerable cohorts. And for the first time into next year, we've been fortunate enough to have an investment in advertising and marketing, so that the program can be promoted and be more accessible. And I know that that will be something that the industry has wanted for some time, and obviously working closely with peak bodies and the industry around that. And then finally, in terms of the timeline, fair to say that we're now at the pointy end of the review, so November to early 2026, really working closely with the government about some of the directions and the findings that came through more than 50 submissions to the review, the consultations we've had with stakeholders one-on-one, and obviously with ESC and the regulators, about the opportunities for change, and we've been really delighted with the level of engagement and response here. It will be a matter for the government about whether it considers any legislative change around that and what it communicates about that. I'd love to say more about that, but it's not my role to preempt where the government will head. But we have been overt that some of these changes will require the potential for legislative change. And if and when that is decided upon by the government, it will communicate on those. And I'm hoping that there'll be some announcements forthwith in relation to those. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm happy to stick around for the Q&A session. Thanks.
Thank you, Stan. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining. As Kate mentioned earlier, my name is Maxi Porter-Hoibeck, and I co-share the role of Director of Development with Kate here at the ESC. Today, I'd like to briefly provide you with an update on our VEU registry system. And as many of you would know, in June this year, we reached a really major milestone, and that was the launch of a new VEU registry, marking really one of the most significant digital transformations in the program's history. And before diving into the detail here, I just wanted to start by saying a huge thank you to all of you. Thank you for your support, your patience, and your feedback as we transition to this new system. We know that change is never easy, and particularly on this scale for a program that's as active and kind of data intensive as the VEU. But our goal has really always been to build a platform that's designed to support the ongoing success of the VEU program, both now and into the future. So to understand the importance of this transition, it's worth reflecting briefly on where we've come from. The legacy VEU registry had served the program well since its creation over 14 years ago. It's fair to say it's been a pretty huge workhorse. It's managed millions of certificates, thousands of accounts, and supported the growth of Australia's largest energy efficiency program. But as the program has evolved, the platform increasingly started to show its age. It was built on some kind of old technology, probably designed for a much simpler time in the program's life. There were increasing security vulnerabilities which were emerging that couldn't really be addressed without major redevelopment. And we had a system that was heavily custom coded, which made every enhancement slow, costly, and sometimes impossible. So even small fixes could take months, and adding new features was often unfeasible. All of that together meant the kind of cumulative effort of maintaining that old platform kept rising with limited returns. In short, it wasn't just about keeping the lights on kind of a situation. It was really about recognising the foundation was no longer fit for the future. And the program's scale, the regulatory requirements, the user needs, they've all grown, and we really needed a modern, flexible platform to match that ambition. So that's where the new VEU registry comes in. It's built on Salesforce's modern cloud-based technology, and that platform gives a secure, scalable, and future-ready foundation. Some of the key benefits include security and reliability, which is backed by Salesforce's continuously updated infrastructure and vendor support. There's scalability here, so the system can really grow as participation and certificate volumes increase. We've got more flexibility, so lots of the changes that we can do now can be made using kind of no-code configuration rather than custom development. We've also got greater access to user experience improvements, so things like smart online forms, replacing PDFs, enabling communication with the platform, and kind of making it more easy to access relevant files. This shift is more than just an IT upgrade. It's really about laying the groundwork for the next decade of the program, and it's about ensuring that the registry evolves with the market, the technology, and the policy directions that will shape Victoria's path to net zero 2045. Now, we know that transition hasn't been without its challenges. And if we move to the next slide, you know, whenever you launch a kind of system of this scale, touching hundreds of users, millions in certificate value, there are going to be some bumps along the way, and just want to acknowledge that up front, that we've really appreciated your feedback and heard you here since the go live in June. You've given us really valuable feedback, which we've acted on. Some of the things you've told us were that the public registry data wasn't available in the way that you needed it, that you were finding reconciliation difficult with the ability to export data. The user admin permissions felt restrictive and were costing you time. And you also wanted to see more information about your VIC holdings in your account. So as a part of that, to address some of those issues, we've built new public registers and dashboards using Power BI, which we released in September this year. That's offering richer, more accessible public data. We've also enabled data export functionality now from that same Power BI tool, using functionality from the public registry, also coming out in September. And we introduced account management self-service, giving you greater control over your own users and permissions. We've also started work on enabling access to deeper VEEC-related data, which we know is critical for your operations. Each of those improvements came directly from some of the feedback that we've received. And while we can't fix everything immediately, your input does really help us prioritise the work that matters to you most. So if you do have further suggestions and feedback, please keep that coming. You can do that via the email. So obviously veu@esc.vic.gov.au, or through the Contact Us form in your portal. The registry is a living system, and it's one that we are really committed to shaping with you. So if I move to the next slide, looking ahead, you know, like I said, acknowledge the new registry isn't perfect yet, but we're really committed wholeheartedly to continuous improvement. And that's kind of running into our focus over the coming months, which includes looking at how we can do enhanced reporting. So that factors in things like the deeper VEEC level data and improved visibility of transaction history. Also looking into streamlining some processes, so common tasks are faster and more intuitive. We've got the release of new activities, a whole bunch that Stan mentioned, which are really critical to the program. So just making sure that the system supports them coming on board and the ongoing evolution into those spaces that have been talked about earlier. There's self-management of RFI users as another component we're looking into. So that'll give businesses kind of greater control over their data. And, you know, we're seeking really here to reduce some of that administrative burden. And then there's a range of kind of additional improvements that we're keen to kind of confirm with you through ongoing engagement. You'll start to see some regular updates from us as all of these new features roll out, including targeted emails and release notes so that you can plan ahead. I just want to close, and moving to the next slide, by recognising that the system transition here is more than just technology. It's about a partnership, and I think the success of the Victorian Energy Upgrades program really depends on that strong, trusted and collaborative relationship that we have between the Commission, industry and government, and your engagement and patience have been really critical in getting us this far. And your feedback through those channels that have been mentioned today will also continue to help us shape the next chapter of the new registry. And through that engagement, we can build what we aspire to, which is the modern, flexible and resilient platform that is the foundation supporting Victoria's energy efficiency goals, being able to empower participants and make it easier for households and businesses to benefit from this really important program. Thank you again for your continued partnership and for helping us make that VEU registry ready for the future. I'll close there, and I'd like to introduce our Director of Regulatory Operations here at the ESC, Caroline Gill.
Thank you very much, Maxi. Now, before I move on to my slides, I've just got a couple of slides with some reminders about some of the amendments that have come in earlier this year. But before we move on to that, I am going to put in a call out for questions. So this year we're using the Q&A function in Teams and asking you to post your questions. Now, if you click on that Q&A function in your Teams window, you'll see that there are a couple of questions that have been asked already. But after my couple of slides, we're moving to a panel and Q&A. So I will really encourage you to post your questions now. Okay, after that reminder, we'll move on. So new developments, Energy Upgrades for the Future Act. So I'm moving to the next slide. So the key changes introduced by the Energy Upgrades for the Future Act. Now, you've heard this mentioned already by Commissioner Patera and by Stan Kapan. There are a number of amendments introduced in that Act, and I'm going to highlight some which are largely different from the ones that Stan mentioned earlier today. So we did hear Stan mention the importance of the VEU program and the Minister's commitment to it and the extension out to 2045. He also mentioned the removal of what's been referred to as the vintage rule. So that was the rule that said that energy retailers, when they're surrendering certificates, can only surrender ones that have been created prior to 31 January in a given year. That rule has now gone. The 30 April deadline for energy retailers now can be extended in two ways. It can be extended by the ESC up until the 30th of May or by the Minister up until the 31st of December that year. Now, that's changed from how it's been to date. This year, energy retailers in the audience in particular will be aware it was extended by the Commission up until the 30th of June. So those arrangements have changed under the amendments that came in this year. There have also been new civil penalty requirements. And sorry, I missed the update to VEET scheme registry account rules, clarifying some transitional arrangements, and particularly, and again, this was of interest to some VSRA holders in particular, specifying that related body corporates are now able to apply for and be granted VSRAs. Those new civil penalty requirements mentioned on this slide. The scheme participants are now liable for complying with the training and competency requirements specified by the Commission when undertaking prescribed activities or regulated action, and they're required to provide evidence of completion of training to the accredited person who will be creating those certificates. The last thing mentioned on this slide is new Commission compliance and enforcement powers. Now, they include improvement notices and prohibition notices. So, the new and expanded compliance and enforcement powers. So, the Commission can now issue prohibition and improvement notices. The improvement notices can be issued to remedy a contravention of the Act or regulations, or to remedy conduct that has caused or is likely to cause harm to human health or safety or damage to property. In relation to prohibition notices, they can be issued to prohibit a person from undertaking prescribed activities or regulated action if they've breached program rules or are likely to cause harm to human health or safety or damage to property. So they're new powers. They came in with effect from the 1st of July this year. I can't give you examples of them being used to date, but I'm mentioning them because we're putting you on notice that we're expecting the Commission will be using those powers. And that's all part of the evolution that Commissioner Patera spoke about, working together with the evolution of the legislative tools and increasing our expectations. Commissioner Patera talked about lifting standards across the program. Now, important to note, a failure to comply with a prohibition notice or an improvement notice is an offence, and the Commission may also take other action in relation to accredited persons, such as suspending or cancelling an existing accreditation. Now, Commissioner Patera also spent a bit of time talking about compliance and enforcement action to date and the importance, the absolute importance of integrity in the VEU program. So you will see on the next slide that again has been supported by some legislative reform with new prohibitions for providing false misleading information to the Commission. These prohibitions apply to all persons, so accredited persons, scheme participants, relevant entities, so energy retailers and other industry participants, and prohibit the provision of false or misleading information to us. So that's incredibly important. When you put that together with the work that Commissioner Patera was highlighting that we've done in enforcement and compliance activities this up till now, even without that prohibition, there have been considerable important enforcement actions being false information involved. These new prohibitions introduce civil penalty requirements as well, which means that the Commission now has access to penalty notices and civil penalty proceedings where the prohibitions are breached. So what does that mean for participants in the program? As Commissioner Patera pointed out, we are looking to lift the standards in the program, and where we're expecting to see changes, and we have seen in part of our investigations this year, is accredited persons in particular lifting their internal audits and quality assurance activities to ensure they can avoid contravening these new prohibitions on provision of false and misleading information. Taking additional efforts to ensure that when you're providing information to us, when you're creating certificates, the information you're providing is complete and sufficient. That's the reminder we wanted to deliver in relation to the amendments that came through and the importance of ensuring internal audit and quality assurance activities, and its increasing importance given these new powers under the Act. I would now like to thank those people who have already put in Q&A. I encourage more of you to add questions into the Q&A function in Teams. And I'm going to hand it back to Kate Phillips, our Director of Development, to facilitate the question and answer segment. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks, Caroline. So we've got about 20-25 minutes remaining for questions, and our Q&A panel includes some of the speakers that you've heard from already today. We've got Commissioner Ellie Patera, Dan Keeley, the Exec Director of VEU at the Commission, and Stan Kapan, the CEO of Solar Victoria. Instructions are up on the screen showing how to open the Q&A window to post a question. Because of the number of attendees, we've got over 200 folks with us in the room today. We're not going to be going to people with their hand raised, so please instead use the Q&A function. And if someone's already posted a question that you'd like to see answered, please upvote it rather than inserting the same question again. This will help us to address similar questions and themes once, which will enable us to get to more questions. And we may respond to some questions that are more straightforward in the Q&A window. If you've got a question that's really technical or specific to your business that won't be relevant to others, reminder to please email us at veu@esc.vic.gov.au or via the VEU Salesforce registry. And we've got some questions coming in. Please, as Caroline said, do continue to post them. But we will now turn to the questions. And the first one that I've got relates to insulation training. So there's been some interest in the content that you presented, Stan. And specifically, people are keen to hear about the training information that focuses primarily on trades, so people who will actually be undertaking the installations. And the question is it possible for APs to also undergo the same training to ensure our compliance processes are looking at the work being submitted to them with a calibrated lens?
Yeah,
so I can throw
Kate.
that to you.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks for the question, Tanya. It is primarily focused at trades because it is very technically oriented. It's a 5-day training program, and it's very practical, and it's on, as you'd expect, the installation of insulation, and it qualifies those people then for certification. There's nothing prohibiting an AP undertaking the training, bearing in mind that some APs will be trades themselves, and that's something that we've been very much encouraging, but it's unlikely given the sort of business model that most APs use. So it is focused on the training for trades, and it has a particular focus on safety and quality, including safety during installation, and then that leads as a precursor to the certification. So at this stage, we're not contemplating anything that's just for the AP aspect about the new activity, and that's partly because what we're looking for, and there'll be some announcements about this shortly, is companies that are already experienced in the insulation sector or have a direct engagement and an arrangement or contract with workers or with other businesses that are already active in the sector.
Thanks, Dan. The next one that we've got, I will throw to Dan, and it's in relation to the ESC's strengthened compliance and enforcement powers, which Caroline spoke to, as well as Stan, in terms of the Energy Upgrades for the Future bill. And the question is whether the ESC will review the continued need for external assurance audits. In other words, what's the evidence that the external assurance audit delivers incremental assurance benefits beyond the ESC's own compliance and audit tools, sufficient to justify the additional cost that ultimately reduces consumer benefit from the scheme?
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Nicholas, for the question. The Assurance Audit Program was introduced as part of the 2023 legislative amendments, and it operates on a statutory basis, requiring all APs at least a 2-year cycle to engage one of our approved auditors, and for that auditor to undertake an assurance audit of the AP. So at present, it's a statutory requirement. We do have some flexibility about the scope of the audit and the targeting of the audit to ensure that we're not using the tool too broadly or imposing too much of a burden. But I would say in the near to medium term, the assurance audit forms an important part of an integrated C&E response. So everything from the accreditation framework and the renewal framework through to the registration of certificates and the analysis that happens there, through our proactive and responsive compliance and enforcement programs, through an increasing field presence and ESC focused audit regime where we will visit sites and we will visit installations to ensure compliance with the scheme standards. And this kind of external independent audit is part of an integrated quality and assurance program across the whole of the VU. So I can't imagine in the short term we would be abandoning it, but certainly, and you'll have observed this over the last 18 months, that we adjust the dials on those various tools to drive increased compliance with the goal of increased integrity across the program. So I think the short answer is we wouldn't be proposing to remove it in the short term, but absolutely we will continue to tweak the scope and the areas that those assurance audits probe to ensure that we're getting good value and good outcomes from an integrity point of view.
Thanks, Dan. We've got another one in from Nicholas, and this one I will throw to Stan. Nicholas is displaying his faculty with maths because he tells me that Activity 6 is currently creating more VEECs than the 2026 and 2027 targets per week. And so the question is, when will the 2028 and future targets be set, and will they allow electrification and other activities to grow again?
Thanks, Kate, and Nicholas. We obviously consult heavily and on targets, and we would expect that through next year we'll be consulting on the targets for 2027 and 2028 and beyond, and that will occur. And we do a couple of things as part of that modelling. One is we recalibrate based on the history of creation since the last target was set. We also recalibrate the modelling because not everything that we model for actually comes into place, or it doesn't come into place by the time that we had anticipated. And you can think, for instance, commercial and industrial solar, or the activity doesn't take off in the way that we had anticipated. So we recalibrate the model for that. We'll obviously take into account any policy announcements, but also new activities, both that have been announced and that haven't been announced, and then consult widely on the targets.
Thank you, Stan. I've got another one in for Dan from Belinda in relation to energy retailer surrender obligations. And she asks, as the surrender dates are not published for energy retailers to surrender, instead being specified in the notice of certificates to surrender, which is issued to the relevant entity, have all energy retailers now surrendered for April 2025?
Thanks, Kate. We will shortly be issuing comms. I'm very conscious that the information about the scheme does have the ability to move the market, whether that's sort of very small information or important information about changes to the scheme. So we are in the final stages of completing the surrender obligations and the calculations and any other actions that might flow through from the 2025 cycle, so for the 2024 compliance year, and we will shortly be issuing comms around the surrender outcomes for the 2024 compliance year. I will say, compared to last year, where we saw significant penalties being paid in a sort of really tight market, this year is pretty close to a full surrender.
Thanks, Dan. I've got one for Ellie in terms of consistency in the Commission's enforcement and compliance approach. And we're wondering how the Commission ensures consistency in compliance outcomes across different APs, especially where similar issues are identified.
Thanks, and that's a great question. Sitting behind our compliance and enforcement activities, and the way they come forward is a framework for determining appropriate responses. Obviously, each particular contravention turns on its facts, and we have regard to different factors that may mean the dial turns up or down. And we've referred to some of those in this to date. So, for example, we talked about self-reporting being a mitigating factor that the Commission might take into account that might mean a slightly different penalty. There might be elements of whether, senior people were involved, the level of kind of misrepresentation or fraudulent activity. All of those things are sort of different pieces of the puzzle that are taken into account. But the Commission has a long history of compliance and enforcement activity. You will see that we work across the energy and water space as well, and we apply quite a bit of discipline in applying those factors uniformly and routinely, time after time. But obviously that doesn't necessarily mean the exact same outcome every time because of the very facts of a particular contravention.
Thanks, Ellie. I've got another one for Stan in relation to one of the SV web pages. And the question is, the official industry market update and work program web page has not been updated since May. And the questioner is wondering whether there are plans to keep this updated moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. We do try and keep it updated, and apologies that it hasn't been updated since then. That's largely because we've been working on some announcements, obviously, in the background, and we work closely with the government about its preferences around communications. But it's not ideal, and we would like to be more open and transparent about that. So we hope to update that in the next few weeks, and particularly as we get closer to 2026, that we're foreshadowing all of those milestones and new activities in 2026 as well, as much as we can.
Thanks, Dan. We've got one for Dan in relation to filtering and how Google search optimization is currently working. And Nicholas says, it's good to see that APs can now be filtered by activity in the new registry. However, Google and AI search engines still seem to push all AP registry queries to the old registry, which obviously has frozen data. Can the old registry now be turned off, as it's not very clear to users Googling that it's not up to date, and obviously it doesn't provide any visibility of APs that have joined the program more recently? Thanks,
Kate, and thanks, Nicholas. You're always got questions which probe in interesting new areas. I wasn't aware of that Google search and sort of search engine optimization issue in relation to APs. I think we'll take that on notice and go and have a look at it. At the moment, the old registry does continue to provide value both internally and externally, as we understand people are still using it to obtain information about the historical market. We do intend probably within the next 6 months or so to decommission the old registry, and that will avoid that issue you're talking about. But perhaps in the meantime we can consider some further banners or branding to make sure people aren't led to the old registry and obtaining incorrect or outdated information. So thanks for picking it up.
Thanks, Dan. We've got another one come in for Stan in relation to the spot price of VEEX. And the questioner is wondering how, as an AP, we can insulate ourselves against the significant swings in the spot price of VEEX, and what factors should APs be looking out for which will affect the price of VEEX?
Oh, wow, I'd love to have an answer to that, but I'm not sure that I'm necessarily the expert. Obviously, we've seen the price move around a lot in the last 12 months. When I first came into this role last June, I think the concern was very much around liquidity and a very high price. And in fact, we had several defaults last year from energy retailers, from obligated parties as a result of that, and some real concerns around the price. And obviously, some of that gets passed through to consumers. We've set about, and the government set about really responding to that. And we had a lot of engagement with the sector around how to improve liquidity. Partly that's resulted in lower targets for next year. Some of the changes that Maxi pointed to around surrender dates and vintage rules has been to provide more flexibility and more liquidity, but obviously new activities are also coming on stream. We saw the market over time respond. So a reduction of about $25 up until just a few months ago. And then I think largely in anticipation of commercial and industrial solar, a really significant reduction. I think we dropped about $20 to $75. It's now trending back up to, I think this morning it was at 85. It went up $3 overnight. How and why that's happening, bearing in mind we're dealing with humans, largely, I hope, at the end of those transactions, and that they are anticipating many, many different factors, not just what the government's doing and some of its announcements, but also things that are happening in the market that we're not privy to, including the trades between parties and forward trades, which are obviously the more or a really dominant part of the market. I can't say how an AP can fortify, other than we do recognise that a volatile market is not ideal, and that we do try and provide that certainty. Part of what's been raised in the strategic review, though, is what are the opportunities for being more transparent about the VEEQ price and how much of that is being passed through to customers. And that's a really important transparency mechanism that exists in other schemes for STCs and LGCs, for instance. And we're very, very interested in looking what options there might be for more transparency, particularly on the pass-through and those margins that are charged. But I'm sorry, that's a long-winded way of not being able to answer the question, just because it's so multifactored, and there are experts that are better at that than I in predicting what some of those driving factors are.
Thanks,
Can I just
Dan.
add to that, Kate, that I think and I think it's a great question, and I appreciate that for APs and SPs as well, that volatility does mean your pricing and your offering to consumers you would expect to change. I think the point I wanted to make, though, is that in our engagement with consumers, while price is a really important factor, probably the overriding factor, I think, and the factor that we are seeking to drive improved outcomes in our action across the program is about quality installations where customers and consumers get really fit for purpose products. And I think the offering in terms of quality products, quality advice, and really quality outcomes is just as important to consumers as price is. And I think that's an important differentiating factor for really good APs and really good scheme participants, and will enhance your reputation and your place in the market.
Thanks, Dan, and thank you, Stan. This one has a couple of different angles, so I will throw it to Ellie first, but I'm conscious that Dan and Stan, you may also wish to add to it. It's around advertising practices in the market. And so Jamie says, we're increasingly seeing misleading advertising practices in the market, including bait and switch tactics that can confuse or disadvantage consumers. Will the VEU be reviewing AP and SP marketing activities in a similar way to the NETCC?
I actually wonder if this is a better one for Dan than it is for me.
I'm happy to have a go. Yeah, I mean, the VEU program and the compliance obligations to both operate under the VEU program and for certificate eligibility under the VEU program inevitably cover other areas of law, other jurisdictions, and other regulators. And I think what we're talking about here is a challenge where we're seeing potential breaches of our own code of conduct, where you're seeing potential misleading advertising or non-compliance with the information that needs to be provided to consumers. And at the heart of the code of conduct, and I often return to this statement, is an expectation of high levels of professional and ethical conduct. So it is absolutely relevant to the VEU rules, but it also likely has relevance to consumer law. And so where we see areas that cut across different jurisdictions and different regulators, we are increasingly improving our engagement through MOUs, through the operation of the regulatory task force, so that we can refer matters in a timely manner with supporting information to our peer regulators so that they're empowered to take action when it falls really clearly within their scope of regulation. But equally, where that is a risk to the integrity of the program, we will consider those matters, and it may respond in a compliance and or enforcement response, and it will be considered as part of an accreditation renewal. So absolutely, we consider it. The last point I'd make on that is, whilst we have dramatically improved and enhanced our data and analytics capabilities, one of the most important sources of intelligence for us is your peers in the market and consumers and other players. And we do have a place on our website where you can report what you consider is sharp practices or non-compliance, and we strongly encourage any operators or consumers to report via that so we can follow it up. We take those really seriously.
Thanks, Dan. Kate, I might just add that it is very much a part of the terms of reference for the strategic review as well, to make sure that consumer protections are at the forefront and that there are proper provisions around that. The government has also, not everything under VEU, of course, comes under the term consumer energy resources, but certainly for things like solar and for hot water and others, where they interact with the grid or they can receive messages, that the government has all throughout this year been consulting on consumer protections for consumer energy resources. And so that may be the subject of additional changes coming into next year. And like Dan, if it is something like a heat pump, for instance, and it's covered by solar homes, we welcome those tip-offs, and we regularly exchange information trends with not only the ESC but also Consumer Affairs Victoria with EWOV and others. We work really closely, and sometimes these things cut across different segments and different products. In solar homes, a participant who's approved, for instance, for heat pump hot water, and most of them, I think 90% of them are APs under ESC, we take into account any conduct outside of the program as relevant to whether they should participate in solar homes as well.
Thanks all. We're nearly at our 11:30 mark, so I think we've just got time for one last question, and I'm going to go with the most upvoted question in the Q&A tab, which is, how does government justify a 435% increase in the VEEC registration fee from $1 in October 2023 to $4.35 by January 2026, barely just 2 years? Do we expect similar percentage increases in the future? And will the registration fee be decreased if targets are increased? I might throw that question to Stan in the first instance, but I'm conscious that Ellie and Dan will also potentially have things to add.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. So obviously, the government takes into account the cost of running the scheme and the cost of the ESC administering the scheme and ensuring that those things balance. But we're also very conscious of, and certainly Minister and Government are conscious of the cost that's borne by consumers of this scheme. We regularly review the cost benefit. Every new activity goes through a cost benefit, and that includes consideration of how fees are set and what impact that has. I don't have the exact VEEC prices going back in history, but my understanding is in 2023, the fee was $1 per certificate, but the price of the certificate was substantially lower than it is today. And it's almost a factor of the fee per certificate is a set dollar amount, but of course that's unrelated. It's decoupled from the price of the certificate. The percentage, if you like, of a $4.35 fee of a certificate when a certificate's trading somewhere between $85 and $115 is still relatively low. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but my recollection is that they're actually quite on par. But obviously we have to take into account the cost of administering the scheme and the number of certificates that are created. All of those are factored into the regulations.
Ellie, did you want to add to that?
I think in some ways Sam sort of acknowledged it in his question. Obviously, targets are lower, fees are higher. I do want to give some comfort that the ESC and as a commission, we're really focused on making sure that this program is running efficiently, and we will continue to look at how the program runs to make sure that we are cost recovering only what is required to efficiently run this program. And you should expect, I think, that we will see a smoothing out over time. Obviously, there's been an expansion of our functions, and that's also something to take into account. But in terms of the revenue generated from the fees, we are not cost recovering more than we were previously. It's a reflection of the targets over time, but a real commitment at our end as an economic regulator to making sure we're running efficiently too, and that our fees are appropriately set for industry.
Thanks, Ellie. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so thank you, Stan, thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Dan, for being on the panel today, and thank you all for all your questions. If you did have a burning question that didn't get answered, please email us at vu@esc.vic.gov.au and we'll do our best to get back to you. And I will now hand back to Dan for closing remarks.
Thanks, Kate. And thanks to my fellow panel members. Thanks to all of you in the audience for taking the time to join us this morning. A big thanks to all the presenters. I hope you come away from this excited about the future opportunities and growth in the VEU program. I think as Stan has reiterated and as the Minister said at All Energy, this is a really important program for the Victorian Government, and there is nothing but ambition and growth opportunities. So we're really excited about that, and we want to use these opportunities to really clarify what we expect of you as industry participants in a program with such ambition so that we can ensure integrity, trust and reputation of the program is enhanced and improved over time. It's been another really big year of change for the VEU program. to the Commission's role and powers with the launch of the new registry system, and we can see that the path ahead will also involve more change and more reform and more ambition. I really hope that our increased engagement and our efforts to streamline and improve our communications and guidance material has helped guide industry through this, and we are really committed to being available, to being present, to be accountable for our administration and regulation of the program. With more change on the horizon, we'll keep improving how we work and support you to make sure you understand and meet your obligations. We will be soon kicking off the first of the industry reference group meetings. That will kick off next month, and that will further facilitate these discussions and improvements. And as always, we welcome your feedback on how these forums and other engagement opportunities can be improved. If you've got other questions, if you need support, we didn't get to your submitted question, please contact us anytime via email or phone or via the VEU registry. The Commission and Solar Victoria contact details are up on the screen. So thanks again for attending. All the best for the rest of the year, and we really look forward to engaging more in 2026. Thanks, folks.